If there's one thing we can all agree on in these divided times, it's that The Rings of Power was an unmitigated disaster. What is much less clear is why this oh-so-horrible show cost Amazon $1 billion. There are no famous actors, no famous writers, and it seems unlikely they blew the budget on graphic design. I mean, that's practically papyrus. So where did all this money actually go? And how did it all go so horribly wrong? In order to answer these most pressing of questions, I must first take you back in time to November the 13th, 2017. Jerome Powell has just been named chair of the Federal Reserve, which worked out great. Kevin Spacey has just been accused of molesting a busboy. The Me Too movement is underway. International tensions with North Korea are at their height as Kim Jong-un tests intercontinental ballistic missiles over Japan. It was against this dramatic backdrop that Amazon made their fateful announcement. They had purchased the global television rights to The Lord of the Rings. We received this news with a mixture of confusion and outrage. It seemed at first as if Bezos and company were undertaking a blasphemous episodic remake of the iconic film trilogy a mere 14 years after its conclusion. Thankfully, this turned out not to be the case. Amazon were instead developing a new series that would explore storylines preceding the events of Fellowship. We breathed a collective sigh of relief, and excitement began to build for a new adventure in Middle-earth. Considering how this adaptation turned out, I regard this excitement now with bitterness. But I've asked you to take this little sojourn down memory lane to remember just how different things were. At the time of Amazon's announcement, we believed we were just entering the golden age of television. Streaming was supposed to take up the mantle of shows like The Sopranos, The Wire, Mad Men, and Breaking Bad, and deliver us a new world of original, thought-provoking dramas in uncommon abundance. Things started out quite well, but the promise of a dynamic new era quickly fizzled out.
What the fuck?
Replaced instead by a hellish soup of dating shows and true crime documentaries.
Fuck you!
But the announcement of the show that became The Rings of Power occurred when we still possessed all of this early hope and excitement, before the endless parade of Star Wars spin-offs and reality shows took that away from us too.
Shut the fuck up!
Amazon poured fuel on the fire of our optimism with the news that they intended to spend $1 billion on their Lord of the Rings series. We should have known better than to fall for such a cheap parlor trick. Instead, we interpreted this preposterous decision as a vote of confidence, as a sign of Amazon's serious commitment to the project. After all, we reasoned not even Amazon could afford to waste $1 billion. They have shareholders to answer to. In order to make good on their investment, they would ensure this was the very best piece of television since 3 William Shatners sang Rocket Man.
And I think it's gonna be a long, long time.
And after getting us worked up into such a stupor, we forgot all about it. Too much time passed with no word. The world was enveloped in turmoil, bouncing from conflict to conflict. Every now and then we might look up and wonder, what happened to that Lord of the Rings show on Amazon? And then there was another variant, another scandal, another disaster. All distractions from what really mattered. Suddenly it was back. Adverts on buses announced the imminent release of something called The Rings of Power. Perhaps a little trite, but evocative, a classic Lord of the Rings reference expertly crafted by a dedicated team of marketing executives and focus groups. No matter, the hope and excitement we had built up returned, only to be dashed as we were subjected to sneak peeks and teaser trailers that threatened to confirm our worst fears. Of course, the marketing department don't make the movie, so we could avoid total despair by clinging to the possibility that the show might still be everything we wanted it to be. And then, after almost 5 years of waiting, we watched it. But it was not as we feared. Somehow, it was even worse.
What is this new devilry?
I won't remind you in gross detail just how bad it was, I'm sure you remember vividly. At the risk of awakening any dormant PTSD, I'll leave it at that. But once the initial shock wore off and an indifferent numbness took its place, I found myself returning to the same, seemingly unanswerable question. What the fuck did they spend all that money on? It's one thing to say you're going to spend $1 billion, it's another thing altogether to actually do it. So what did it really cost to make the Rings of Power? To start with, Amazon spent $250 million just to acquire the rights from the Tolkien family estate. More absurd is what this huge sum actually bought. Nothing more than the rights to adapt the appendices of The Return of the King and The Hobbit. The ensuing celebration at the Tolkien household must have been quite the spectacle. Amazon planned to spend $1 billion to make 5 seasons of The Rings of Power. This figure was to include the cost of the rights, leaving $150 million per season. This is a lot of money to you and me, but even at this point in time was not an unusual sum for higher-end television dramas. In 2017, Season 1 of The Crown and Season 7 of Game of Thrones cost about $10 to $15 million per episode. Somehow Amazon overshot this relatively modest amount, reportedly spending $465 million on just the first season, which was only 8 episodes long, meaning that each episode cost a little over $58 million. This gigantic number excludes the cost of the rights, meaning that the total cost of bringing the Rings of Power to fruition was almost $750 million. While I won't claim to be sure of many things, I think I can safely say that this is the lowest dollar to entertainment ratio in the history of show business, with the possible exception of Avatar 2. You may have noticed this doesn't quite add up to $1 billion. Well done. But before accusations of clickbait come flying at me yet again, it's worth noting that this figure doesn't include any marketing or publicity costs, certain to be astronomical given the Rings of Power's ubiquitous and incessant promotion. What's more, the Rings of Power Season 2 is about to be released.
Oh, goody.
And while it was reportedly less expensive than the first, that certainly doesn't mean it was cheap. So there's little doubt in my mind that they've spent at least $1 billion by now. It's sort of besides the point. Amazon made the most expensive TV show of all time, more expensive even than the most expensive films ever made. Whether or not they spent precisely $1 billion, whatever way you slice it, Amazon spent way too much money to make something this bad. But if you didn't know that the Rings of Power cost nearly $1 billion, I'm not sure you'd be able to tell just by looking at it. The cinematography is technically excellent, the visual effects are usually very good and occasionally great. On a superficial level, the Rings of Power looks about as good as it should, with one glaring exception. What is surprising, puzzling even, is the near total lack of famous names and faces. The most expensive part of most expensive productions is the cast. A single actor is often the single most expensive part of a film. Will Smith, for example, was apparently paid $40 million of King Richard's $50 million budget. Post-slap, I wonder if his pay is less out of disgust or more out of fear. This is an extreme example, but the fact remains that a disproportionate amount of the spending on big-budget productions tends to go towards super-famous actors. This is not the case in The Rings of Power. Here the cast is almost entirely comprised of unknown actors. Truly remarkable for a show with a bigger budget than Fast X. It is not an inherently bad thing to have an entirely unknown cast. In some cases, it's a great asset, allowing the audience to bond more easily with the characters, without the baggage of an actor's fame. Nor is celebrity necessarily indicative of talent or ability. This show could not have been saved by the cast of The Expendables. That the cast is unknown is not an indictment of their skill. Honestly, I find it difficult to judge their performances given the state of the script. But for a show this expensive, an unknown cast is very unusual. It is almost standard practice to cast someone recognizable to anchor a new show. Game of Thrones had the great Sean Bean, The Witcher had Henry Cavill, and most of us knew Heisenberg first as Malcolm's dad. Someone we're already familiar with can help something new feel less strange. And sure, there were a couple of famous faces to be seen. In what is surely a career low, British comedy legend Lenny Henry plays the third most annoying hobbit. But even he is not that well known to me. My generation probably knows him best for Red Nose Day or as the voice of the shrunken head on the night bus in The Prisoner of Azkaban. The other familiar face has been completely obscured. My fellow countryman Peter Mullen can barely be seen beneath a mountain of dwarf drag. I don't know if being Scottish counts as being part of a marginalised group nowadays, the criteria are ever-changing, but if so, this was surely a hate crime. At least we now have legislation to remedy this grave injustice. With no offence intended to Lenny Henry or Peter Mullen, a budget of this size should boast a few certified A-listers. Comparatively expensive show 1923, which reportedly cost a measly $30 million an episode to The Rings of Power's 58, stars both Harrison Ford and Helen Mirren. Pick any metric you like, box office gross, awards, talk show appearances, IMDb's ridiculous star meter. These are two of the most famous actors on the planet, and they have been for more than 40 years. The only people more unknown than the cast of The Rings of Power are its creators, although by now they have achieved a level of infamy comparable perhaps to that of Dr. Joseph Mengele or Pol Pot. J.D. Payne and Patrick Mackay were the winners of Amazon's lengthy search for a creative team that could bring their Lord of the Rings spin-off to life. Theirs were obscure names among the others in consideration. The Russo brothers of Avengers fame suggested an Aragorn origin story. Peter Jackson appears to have been approached by Amazon then expressly forbidden from being handed the reins of the show at the urging of the Tolkien estate, who were unimpressed with his work on the Hobbit trilogy. I don't blame them. Payne and Mackay proposed something simple yet elegant. They would turn the first 5 minutes of The Fellowship of the Ring into a 50-hour television series. Amazon loved it. There was just one small, very tiny problem. Payne and Mackay were yet to write anything, not even a fucking short film, that had actually been produced. Their only credits from before The Rings of Power are as uncredited writers on Star Trek Beyond, where apparently they helped punch up the script for J.J. Abrams. They must have done a good job, because when Amazon hesitated over their lack of experience, Payne and Mackay called in J.J. to close the deal. Yet one more black mark in the complicated legacy of J.J. Abrams. While an unknown cast has its virtues, hiring two guys who couldn't even get an official credit on Star Trek Beyond to shepherd a billion-dollar adaptation of the most beloved fantasy work in the English language is without any obvious upside and with predictable, demonstrable downside.
There's a tempest in me!
Speaking as someone who has also never had anything produced, I don't mean this to impugn their writing per se, although there is plenty to be impugned. As with acting, lack of experience does not guarantee bad writing. But Payne and Mackay were not just writers, they were also the showrunners, a massive responsibility requiring constant decision-making across all production departments, meaning they were unable to give their undivided attention to the most important part of that job, the writing. Of course, the blame must rest with Amazon. Payne and Mackay were simply doing their job, albeit badly. The Amazon studio executives who hired them deserve all of our vitriol. And considering the princely sum Amazon spent on The Rings of Power, they could have hired a showrunners Avengers led by David Chase and Aaron Sorkin. Their decision to turn over the keys to this billion-dollar car to two thoroughly inexperienced and unknown writers remains inexplicable. The only plausible explanation is that they just didn't think it mattered all that much. But the question remains, if the budget didn't go toward famous actors and established writers, then where did it go? Without receiving an itemized breakdown, which of course couldn't be made public without launching an outraged audit, all we can do is read between the lines. Amazon claims to have spent a lot of money on set design. In interviews, some cast members attest to how immersive the sets were, and how surprised they were not to be constantly in front of green screens. Of course, they remain on the payroll for Season 2. Somewhat contradicting this, Amazon readily admits to an astonishing amount of VFX work. 10,000 VFX shots were worked on by 1,500 visual artists at 20 different companies. This is more VFX shots than the entire film trilogy, which has a similar runtime. Some poor bastard spent 3 days just working on the rock-breaking scene. As is the fashion in Hollywood, this work was largely outsourced to the developing world. An optimist might catch a glimpse of progress in this. At least now they're only digitally animating back-breaking manual labour, although I expect the pay isn't much better. There were other expensive hurdles. The production had to deal with COVID delays and on-set testing protocols. They shot on location in New Zealand, which is no longer the well-kept secret Peter Jackson utilised 2 decades ago. But as expensive as I'm sure all this was, and it must have been to total $465 million, none of it really makes a difference to the quality of the show. Yes, great set design is nice, good VFX is better than bad, but neither of these can save a bad story. A rational person, given all the money in the world, would make sure to get the fundamentals right first, to hire the best writer for the job, to spend time honing the script, to go to the ends of the earth casting the perfect actors and roles they were born to play. Only then would the same rational person begin splurging resources on such secondary considerations as visual effects and set design. These things are important, of course, but without the solid foundation of a great story are, quite literally, just window dressing. And it's not like Amazon suffers from limited resources. They could afford both to spend time and money on hiring a great writer to develop a perfect script, and on all of the flashy VFX and set pieces money can buy. But how they chose to allocate their unlimited resources betrays what was really important to them, and conversely, what wasn't. What's clear from the way they spent their budget is that Amazon didn't have to spend so much money making The Rings of Power. Without hiring famous actors and experienced writers, they were spared the greatest of production expenses and could have made The Rings of Power for less than your average time-traveling costume drama. But rather than hoarding money, as we might expect from a multinational corporation, Amazon decided to waste hundreds of millions of dollars. This wasn't some gross oversight. Decisions like this aren't taken lightly. Even for a $1.5 trillion company, this was not a trivial amount of money. We have to conclude that this was a choice, not an accident. Consider why Amazon wanted to make The Rings of Power in the first place. It's not because the board of directors all love The Lord of the Rings. They're a business, so there's a financial motivation behind this decision. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to make profit. There are lots of activities Amazon could have undertaken to make money, and for some reason they decided that making The Rings of Power was the most profitable choice. More than that, they all agreed that making The Rings of Power and spending $1 billion to do it was the best way to make the biggest profit. The primary goal of all streaming platforms is to increase subscriber growth, sometimes even at the cost of short-term profits. Disney Plus, for example, actually loses money at the moment because they are more interested in attracting new subscribers. Profits and corresponding price increases can come later. But in the meantime, subscriber growth signals the potential for profits, attracting investors and driving up Disney's share price. Amazon is in the same business. With Prime at near saturation in North America and Western Europe, they turned their attention to global markets in order to find new subscribers. They were not alone. Netflix has made big pushes into foreign language markets, with a plethora of shows designed to appeal to international audiences. Think Narcos and Squid Game. While Netflix focused on original content in different languages and locations, Amazon sought the Disney shortcut, the fruits of which we have been rather cruelly subjected to for the past 15 years. Rather than creating new stories, Disney simply bought up the rights to existing intellectual property with built-in, near-rabid fan bases, and universal appreciation bordering on worship that transcends cultures, languages, and common sense. Star Wars and Marvel. Amazon believed they could do the same with The Lord of the Rings. Less because Bezos is the Tolkien superfan he claims to be, and more because it was really the only treasured piece of IP left. Banking on Tolkien's renown and the massive success of the film trilogy, The Rings of Power would bring Amazon Prime to new subscribers all over the world. But spending $1 billion just to get some new subscribers paying $9.99 a month is a pretty big gamble. According to the Wall Street Journal, the $715 million spent by Amazon on the rights and production of Season 1 is equal to approximately 5.2 million new Prime members. So did it work? It's hard to say, but the twisted thing is that it didn't have to. Amazon actually loses money on Prime, taking an average net loss of $11 per user in order to fulfill all of the supposed benefits of membership. At first, this is confusing. Why go to all this effort to get new Prime subscribers when they cost you more than you make? Are they secretly philanthropists, masochists? Of course not. Amazon makes money through Prime not with membership fees, but with something diabolical called the streaming to retail pipeline. After signing up for Prime to watch The Rings of Power or The Grand Tour or The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, Amazon encourages users to explore the other benefits of membership. Pretty soon, the convenience of Amazon Prime has won over a loyal new customer who spends an average of $1,400 per year. The entire purpose of Prime Video is to act as a marketing funnel to get more people shopping on Amazon. In that light, The Rings of Power was never a creative venture. It was never a passion project by Tolkien superfans for Tolkien superfans. It was always just a great, big, billion-dollar advert for Amazon. Amazon spent $1 billion not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. Why? For attention. Amazon wanted the headlines. They wanted the hype, the inevitable excitement and wild speculation that comes with such a ridiculous announcement. They wanted to get people talking, not about the Rings of Power because it didn't exist yet, but about Amazon. So it wasn't just the $1 billion budget that was designed to get our attention. The whole thing was a publicity stunt. The entire production of The Rings of Power was a marketing ploy, designed to get people to sign up to Amazon Prime. Announcing the show was the whole point. Actually making the show was a minor inconvenience, an afterthought, which perhaps after nearly 20 minutes of incessant rambling, finally explains why The Rings of Power cost $1 billion. For no more substantial a reason other than it sounds good. After all, Amazon's whole approach to The Rings of Power was superficial. The show was optimized for the teaser trailer, not the narrative arc of an 8-episode series. That's why they spent their massive budget in such a strange way. They essentially licensed the Lord of the Rings brand name for $250 million. This removed the need for famous actors. Tolkien's world is better known and loved than any A-list starlet. Plus, any recognizable names and faces would distract from the show's true star, Amazon. They spent a lot of time and money on VFX to get striking, epic visuals for the trailer, and they didn't bother hiring proven writers because really all a good trailer needs are some battle scenes and a few intense stare-downs. And according to Amazon, it worked. While we don't know exactly how many people signed up to Prime just to watch The Rings of Power, Amazon considers it a great success. And they might well be right. Amazon's stock price is up quite a lot since the day The Rings of Power was released, and they've added 100 million more Prime subscribers since the initial announcement in November 2017. If each one is worth the aforementioned $1,400 a year, I'll let you add up just how much money that is over 6 years. But while Amazon considers it a success, the fact remains that the audience hated it. I hated it, I'm sure you hated it, you're here after all. The Tolkien superfan in your life hated it. Audience reactions, wildly divergent from suspect critics, were so full of vitriol and so numerous that Amazon suspended reviews. Online forums like Reddit were for once unanimous in their hatred of the show. And while this is largely anecdotal, we do have one key piece of actual data to back this up. Completion rate is a metric used by streaming companies that measures the percentage of people who started watching a show that finished it. Netflix routinely cancels shows that don't see at least a 50% completion rate. Squid Game is an example of a highly successful show by this metric with a completion rate of 87%. The Rings of Power only had a 37% completion rate in North America. Internationally, this number grows to a whopping 45%. But then we don't all have quite such an entertaining political cycle. Of course, the slight flaw in completion rate is that it doesn't account for those of us who hate-watched The Rings of Power to the bitter end. It also doesn't account for people who fell asleep in front of the TV, or who physically couldn't turn it off because they were busy hanging from a ceiling fan. But despite this abject failure from the audience's point of view, Amazon maintains that The Rings of Power was an unequivocal success. Financially, they're probably right. It seems Amazon cannot lose. But this puts us in an untenable position. The traditional model was not perfect, but at least the trade was straightforward. You give me something entertaining to watch, and I might not change the channel during the adverts. The more people watched a show, the more money the network charged for advertising. So if nothing else, they had an incentive to make very entertaining shows. Not perfect, but coherent. Whereas the new model, the streaming model, is largely disconnected from this kind of simple feedback mechanism. The core of the business is subscribers. Even a 100% completion rate doesn't directly affect the bottom line. All that matters is how many new users sign up. That is how a show's success is judged. That is the philosophy that governs what gets made. In this paradigm, Amazon has more of an incentive to make a great trailer than a compelling show. It seems like Netflix and other streaming companies would be susceptible to the same problem, and to a degree they are, but they remain much more sensitive to the audience because they only sell one thing. Amazon dilutes the negative consequences of disappointing its audience because it sells everything. What is a product for Netflix is mere marketing for Amazon. This dissonance can't go on forever. It's simply not sustainable to have audiences and producers so firmly at odds like this long term. But in the short term, in the medium term, we should be prepared for it to get much, much worse. For the simple reason that we have no recourse. For the time being, we, the audience, are powerless. What can we really do? Cancel Prime? Go back to books and box sets and shipping in 3 to 5 business days? I think not. If you're not already an Amazon Prime subscriber, there's still hope.
Just a fool's hope.
You may yet avoid getting sucked in by this dastardly apparatus. It's too late for me, my fate is sealed. In the not too distant future, I'll be sitting down to watch The Rings of Power Season 2, disgusted with myself but holding on to the comfort of speedy delivery and the ability to stream Bosch Legacy with ads whenever I feel like it. Save yourselves, while you still can.
Hurry, you fools!
Now, I've heard a lot about your desk.
It's a door with 4x4s.
Come on.
What?
I mean, you can afford a better desk than that.
It's a symbol
Yeah.
of spending money on things that matter to customers and not spending money on things that don't.